Behind the headlines, the Americans with Disabilities Act is 26 years old, the signature law of George H.W. Bush's presidency. It guarantees equal civil rights and access to public places to people with disabilities, and yet it can still be pretty tough to get around for a lot of people, despite the law's promise. Disability rights advocate Matt McCullough took us on a tour of entryways in a downtown area from our perspective and from his perspective to show us how getting in and out of many public accommodations, storefronts, restaurants, hotels, and office buildings can be daunting if you're on crutches or in a wheelchair, or even just carrying lots of bags or rushing in out of the rain. Matt pointed out the irony in this sign, which says anyone who needs assistance entering can ring the bell for help. The sign and the door are up 3 old stone steps.
If you're in a wheelchair, how do you contact anybody to come out and give assistance?
Even though the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, has been the law for more than a quarter century, and businesses open to the public are supposed to be accessible to everyone, they're not. And this doesn't just harm people with disabilities.
We have a pluralistic view of this world where people who are getting older and having difficulty walking, people that are pushing strollers with children, people who are pulling carts with their computers and all of the other things that they've got in their bags that are too heavy to carry, or they're going to develop shoulder problems. They're all using the accessible features of a pluralistic environment.
The reason so many buildings lack ramps or automatic doors or things that make them accessible is being in compliance with building codes is based on a public reporting system. It is only when someone files a complaint with the Justice Department that investigators and lawyers go into action. The Justice Department, which is charged with enforcing the ADA, sends out investigators who negotiate with business owners to install automatic doors or ramps, and in some cases pay fines, up to $150,000 for repeat offenders and more in special cases. But the Justice Department's ADA Compliance Division is overwhelmed and simply cannot discover and prosecute every continuing violation. Its website lists pending claims and recently settled suits. One large settlement earlier this year was negotiated with Greyhound bus lines for failing to make buses accessible to thousands of disabled users. The Greyhound suit was typical of those against large employers who are not making their public accommodations accessible to all types of potential consumers. The federal government also runs about a half-dozen centers around the country to help people with disabilities find out how to make sure public accommodations are accessible and that workplaces don't discriminate against them. Marian Vessels runs one of them. She's a friendly, persuasive, helpful ambassador for the ADA. So now we're in Ellicott City, which is a beautiful old historic town outside of Washington, D.C., between Washington and Baltimore, and we're at the Creative Arts Studio and Gallery called the Clayground. And the Clayground offers classes and all kinds of things like learning how to fuse glass. And Marian came here several months earlier to try to take one of the classes, and she found it was inaccessible. But the owner, Charlene Randolph, was very helpful and made it accessible.
Charlene was here and I started talking with her about, what the ADA says about accessibility, and it'd be really nice to be able to come and go independently and be able to take other classes. And so she said, oh, well, let's look it up, and said that the ramps were really pretty inexpensive. And she said, yeah, I can do that.
I'm happy to do it. I mean, I know, I'm sure I'll write it off somehow, but it just made so much sense to me. You were probably talking $20,000 by the time you're done. Okay, what small business person, mom and pop store down here in Ellicott City has that kind of money? So when she told me there was a portable solution, my brain just went, really? Are you sure?
Some large permanent ramps can cost that much money, even more. But the temporary ramp Charlene uses was a fraction of that cost. Marion is also quick to point out there are tax credits for businesses that become accessible. There is also what is called the business case for making businesses accessible.
It's estimated that at least 1 in 5 people have disabilities. And we have family and friends. And so, often, I don't go by myself to do things. I'm bringing a friend. I go shopping and I eat out and, sleep in hotels and do all these things. And usually with other people. So there is a huge business opportunity that if you're not welcoming to people with disabilities, you're missing not only their buying power, but those are their family and friends as well.
Not all business owners say they can afford accessible alterations or afford to rent storefronts large enough to be accessible. And not all people filing complaints are honest. Travis Hausauer ran a small burger shop in Sacramento, California, and was almost put out of business by people who demanded money when he failed to comply.
Because of my being sued and having to move my business, I've lost $60,000 a year income because I didn't have to pay rent. I also sold the property at half of what I paid for it because after all this, it really didn't have the value that it had. And the $60,000 a year will continue as long as I stay in business. I can't make that up. So that's a loss that I have to endure.
Still, Marion Vessels trudges on in her pursuit to inform all disabled persons of their rights under the ADA. On this day, she addressed a small group of veterans at a conference in Washington, D.C.
I was injured in a car accident when I was in college, so I've been in a chair for 42 years. But you develop other disabilities. So for most people, it's not the exception to have more than one disability. But people kind of think, oh my gosh, well, you've got one. I developed breast cancer about 20 years ago, and my doctors were all like, oh my gosh, you're in a chair, and you have breast cancer.
She coached the veterans on how to explain that small barriers to people without disabilities can be major barriers to those with them.
They may think it's only 1 or 2 steps, or it's only a 6-inch.
That's right.
And they say, well, I might as well fly.
Exactly.
They just don't comprehend that really is a barrier to your employment. Now you can't get in anymore. And I found that just working with the company I was, we were able to work things out satisfactory for 23 years.
When I was injured 42 years ago, there wasn't a lot of places that were accessible. And you didn't have cell phones. You didn't have ways to let people know. And I did, I would call ahead before I'd leave and say, are you, I'm in a wheelchair, are you accessible? Oh, yeah. And I'd get there and there'd be this 6-inch step.
David Capozzi runs the agency in charge of making sure all federal buildings are accessible. He travels internationally to represent the U.S. at conferences on universal access design. While the U.S. still isn't 100% accessible, David says,
I think it's testament that other countries come to us to learn about our successes. Because we've started before, we have good legislation, we have good public policy, and so I think that's just testament enough that countries want to learn from our experiences.
So, Marion, welcome to the panel. David said essentially we're the best in the world, and yet we're really not that good when, in terms of, from the perspective of disabled people, myself included. I broke my neck and damaged my spinal cord 5 years ago, and have trouble sometimes getting in and out of places. So is voluntary compliance the answer?
When you look at the scope of the ADA, we're looking at employment, places of business, state and local government, websites, telecommunication, transportation. That really is the only option. So we need to educate all individuals about the importance of the ADA and the importance of full inclusion for people with disabilities.
I do want to say, here come the baby boomers, and we're going to see this statute really take off like wildfire. But on voluntary compliance, that's how most of our laws. To be sure, with the employment laws, there can be commission-initiated complaints, but the way in which we have gotten at discrimination against blacks and women is they file complaints. Here we have what Marion is doing. She's filing a complaint, and the lawyers have discovered her because though she couldn't, or someone in her position couldn't get damages, the lawyers can get attorney's fees, and they are now rushing to take these suits. It's called private attorney general. That's a very important part of the anti-discrimination statutes.
Which all sounds wonderful, Eleanor, but here we are 26 years later, and there are more public accommodations out of compliance than in compliance.
And those are before 1990, and that's
buildings built before 1990
when the statute was passed, and that's why it's very. Of course, we have some who are non-compliant even afterwards, but going after those others and finding a way for even small businesses, and we're very much complimenting you and making her understand that there were acceptable ways for small business to come into compliance.
You know, in the data, what's interesting about this is it's at the level of core value now. So yes, there's a little bit of contention with small business. I'm a small business owner. I'm sympathetic to $20,000. But actually, this has gotten beyond policy to core value. You have 88% of Americans now who want accommodation for employment. You have anywhere from 2/3 to 3/4 who want it in all kinds of purchasing. So America's actually really ready for this conversation, and it doesn't have to be contentious. I think we can support small businesses, but we can move forward. And you're right, boy, when the baby boomers get there, everybody, it's all about them to the baby boomers, right? I say that as one.
That is fabulous data. Thank you for
great.
that. And you've had experience without disabilities, just with helping family members who have them.
My father is a polio survivor. For as long as I've grown up, the ADA was at the centerpiece of the things we loved about America because he's from India originally, and he says what's beautiful about this country is we value each individual life. People come and rush to our aid as we as a family go out to dinner and we see that there's a step there and we've got to lift Dad's wheelchair. Just recently I ordered a ramp online to make my home accessible for my dad's wheelchair, and it's interesting to see what challenges we as family members have to face, but it's so good where we are right now. I look at other countries in the world, they don't even have what we have. We can do better though, I completely agree. And things like tax credits for small businesses, that makes it all the more sweeter.
All right, that's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/to the contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week. Everybody was that was